Hello, my friends. Today my guest is Dr. Ruth Patterson, who's a professor at the UCSD Department of Family Medicine and Public Health and leader of the Cancer Prevention Program at Moores Cancer Center at UCSD. Thank you, Ruth, for being here. I'm very interested in some of the research that you have been doing for the past few years and ongoing in terms of looking at this interface between metabolism and specifically breast cancer risk and breast cancer, increased breast cancer recurrence. So I know when I think, of lifestyle factors that are modifiable and that are actually known to increase breast cancer risk, obesity comes to mind.
Sure. Obesity is definitely one of the big ones, and also physical activity. More recently, we've become aware of the importance of physical activity. What's been harder for us to identify is exact types of foods that could reduce risk. And in fact, we've not really had a lot of success in identifying individual foods or individual nutrients that seem to make a difference. Although I think there's more acceptance now of the idea that an entire dietary pattern, let's say the Mediterranean dietary pattern, may influence risk over decades. So I would say those are probably the top concerns, is diet quality, obesity, physical activity. Those are the things. And even tobacco can increases breast cancer risk. Mm-hmm. So there's many things individual women can do to reduce their risk.
I was reading, I think maybe the American Cancer Association had published some statistics on how obesity can increase the risk of breast cancer by twofold. Mm-hmm. And also specifically looking at some of the mechanisms by which obesity can increase breast cancer risk. There were a variety of them, including increased inflammation, increased hormone, so estrogen, and also increased fasting insulin levels. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think we've known for a long time about sex hormones, in particular estrogen, as a risk factor, because some of our first really successful drugs were based on blocking the action of estrogen. Estrogen's a growth factor, so it appears if we can block that, it can reduce your risk or reduce your risk of recurrence. And we have some pretty effective drugs that have made a big difference. It's more recently that we've realized that other growth factors have the same type of impact. And it's almost common sense. If estrogen is a growth factor and that increases growth rates of tumors, well, what about insulin? It's also a growth factor. It encourages metabolism. So we do believe that perhaps high levels of circulating insulin may be really central to the whole process of developing breast cancer and promoting its growth. And high levels of insulin are definitely found in women who are overweight, if you're less physically active, and then, of course, among diabetics, often have high circulating levels of insulin. So we are becoming more aware that that may be kind of a common road where many different syndromes lead to the increased risk of breast cancer.
And so insulin, so you mentioned that people that are overweight and people that are obese have higher circulating insulin levels. They also have higher circulating estrogen levels, right? So does fat can secrete, am I right? Fat can secrete estrogen, or is that something
Fat can, yes. So that's pretty central. And then what we also know is that people who have high levels of insulin have lower levels of serum hormone binding globulin, something called SHBG, which binds estrogen, so it can prevent it from being active. So they seem to be related. They're not just two independent pathways. They actually play off each other.
And you brought up something that was very, I think, important, and that is you said that these growth factors, they promote the growth of tumor cells, of cancer cells. These are...
Right. That's in a very general way.
Right. Yeah, so you're something's causing the initial damage, the cells become damaged, and we have a lot of mechanisms inherent in our cells that can sense damage and say, well, okay, I'm going to die. I'm going to kill myself because if I don't, it may potentially lead to a cancer cell. Right. But if you have all these growth signaling factors happening in the presence of that damage, it's sort of saying, hey, no, keep going, keep growing, don't die, grow.
Yes.
And so that's sort of like, I think, the combination between things that are causing the damage, which possibly high inflammation, so obesity also is associated with high inflammation, and then in the combination of the inflammation and the high insulin-like growth factor, the high estrogen, it's sort of like this detrimental combination of damage and growth signals to allow them to survive. You also mentioned the serum binding hormone, that
serum hormone binding globulin.
Yeah, that's
SHBG.
It. Thank you. and you mentioned that binds estrogen and sort of makes it inactive from going to activate, I guess, in breast tissue or whatever tissues. What about also the insulin? So I mentioned the insulin-like growth factor pathway, which is separate, but from insulin, they're two separate growth factors, but they're also very interconnected.
I think the data on insulin-like growth factor is a little less consistent and a little harder for us to understand. So we think it's also playing a role, but studies have been, some studies have found it to be a risk factor and other studies haven't. And you're talking about circulating levels, I'm sure, because it's also very complex because there's receptors for these things on the cells that may also play in.
Right.
So it's a very complex system, which is why we've had such a hard time coming up with cures. Is because there's lots of redundancies and one system affects another system. And so just finding like that magic pill that can turn off all these different related pathways is virtually impossible. There's so many workarounds for our body. Our body is incredibly resourceful.
Right. So these three factors that are known, the high fasting insulin, the high free estrogen, and the high inflammatory markers. So as measured by certain biomarkers like C-reactive protein.
Right.
So these are all associated with, in some cases, even 2 to 3-fold increased risk.
Yeah, it's definitely twofold and maybe a little bit more. I think that's generally what the metric we use. Each one of them increases the risk individually by twofold. Combination-wise, we don't know. It's probably not quite additive, but they still would have a combined effect too. That's reason to look at all these different pathways. But those are definitely the 3 major metabolic pathways that we think feed into having kind of fertile soil so that when these DNA changes happen, they're in a place where they're kind of like fertile soil, more likely to go to an invasive tumor type.
Okay. And what's so interesting about this is that your work and the work of others is showing that these 3 different biomarkers, let's say, they can be modified by changing your lifestyle pattern.
Right. Much of my research lately has focused on timing of meals, which I think is a little bit of a newer hypothesis. We all evolved to eat during the day when we're out getting our food and then fast at night when we're in a rest state. But now with modern lighting and with modern lifestyles and longer and longer work weeks, our meal patterns less and less resemble the way we evolved to eat. And we believe that it's very metabolically detrimental to eat a lot of energy and then right away lay down. What are you doing? You're laying down. You don't need to have all that energy on board and all that metabolism going on when actually you should be in a fasting catabolic state.
And most people probably actually eat one of their largest meals in the evening.
Right, which is just so just even in a common sense way. Why do you need all that energy right before you're about to become completely comatose? It makes no sense, right? You really need the energy during the day, when you're busy up walking.
That's a very good point. And I think you also mentioned another important point, and that is eating during the day when we're supposed to eat, and timing it with our circadian rhythm, which is the biological clock inside of every cell. We've got a master regulator and different tissues, which we can talk about in a minute. But that master clock, what's interesting is that it regulates, between 10 to 15% of the human genome is regulated by these clocks, and about 50% of those genes are involved in metabolism.
Right.
And humans are the most insulin sensitive upon waking, first thing in the morning. And then as the day goes, insulin sensitivity goes down. And so, eating your biggest meal in the evening when you're the most insulin insensitive would increase one of those biomarkers that you're talking about.
Right, or just metabolically dysregulate you, which is what we're trying to have regulated metabolism, and that definitely dysregulates it. And the whole circadian rhythm concept is the idea that, as you mentioned, the master clock is trained to light. It responds to light. So the master clock's getting the signal, let's say in the evening, you're done. But if you're eating, the peripheral clocks, like in your liver, are going, no, we're waking up, we're getting energy. And we believe that when those two clocks are out of sync, that itself leads to some type of metabolic dysregulation. And we don't have fully metabolic, or molecular understanding of exactly how this works. But it's a pretty solid theory, at least what we've seen in animal research.
Yeah, so I mentioned to you earlier that I talked about this meal timing with a collaborator of yours, Dr. Sachin Panda, who's at the Salk Institute, and he a lot of his research had focused on elucidating this important regulator of the peripheral clocks, meaning the clocks in the non-brain, so the liver,
right.
The heart,
pancreas,
right, and how when you eat your first meal, or even taking your first non-water beverage, starts that clock. And so if you start that clock, let's say you wake up at 7:30 in the morning and you have a sip of coffee, 7:30 in the morning, the clock starts. And he's shown that eating all your meals within at least a 12-hour time from that, when that clock starts, seems to be very important for having a good metabolic health,
right.
good glucose regulation, good insulin sensitivity, being able to maintain lean muscle mass and keep fat loss off. But what's really, in my mind, I was trying to understand, and like you mentioned, we don't know all the molecular mechanisms between the timing of the two, both the master clock and the peripheral clock, but how they do seem to be working together. So, let's say someone fasts in the morning. They don't eat breakfast, they don't eat lunch. And then, so they're fasting, let's say they're fasting for 12 hours, and then they eat a meal right before bed.
Right.
We don't know if that's necessarily going to be as good as fasting during the evening when we're in sync.
We totally don't think it's as good. So our research seems to show that two things. One, we see our biggest reductions in breast cancer, for instance, recurrence, with at least 13 hours of fast. And we really believe that fast needs to start around 7, maybe to 8 p.m. at night. When people talk about breakfast, what I often say is, when you're talking to people who skip breakfast, I think skipping breakfast is actually a marker of eating at night. Because if you stop eating early in the evening and don't eat for 13 hours, when you wake up, you're starving. You don't skip breakfast. So a lot of times I think the research showing that not eating breakfast or skipping breakfast is bad is actually not studying breakfast. It's the people who skip breakfast were eating late into the night. So we think it's both. It's that we need a long stretch of time, and there might be some improvements in gut rest or the microbiome. We don't think that your GI tract also was meant to have food constantly in there, So we think that it's important to have a long stretch of gut rest, but that gut rest happens at night, starting fairly early, 7 or 8 p.m., and then 13 hours after that. So it's both of those things, and either one is not sufficient.
Right. And the microbes in your gut are also on that circadian rhythm.
Absolutely. So, yes, the GI tract is very, very tied to circadian controls.
Right. You also mentioned another study that one of your research, you kind of said in passing that at least 13 hours of fast was associated with a lower breast cancer recurrence.
Right.
So do you mind talking about that study for a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So this was a study in about 2,500 breast cancer survivors, and they completed over about 7.5 years of follow-up. They completed many food records, right? So we collected all this information about what they ate. But then more recently, when this hypothesis came out, we went and dug up all their food records and said, well, how about if we don't care what you ate, but we just care about when you ate it. So we re-entered all the data as far as when they started to eat, when they stopped, how long their fasting interval was, how much they ate at night. and then reanalyze that data. And that's where we found that it seemed, at least in this sample of women, that the cut point of 13 hours reduced their risk of breast cancer recurrence by about 40%. It also reduced the risk of mortality by about 20% or a little more than that, but that was not statistically significant. But it was just trending in the same direction. It's possible. Because we do believe although my area of research is breast cancer, we actually believe this dietary pattern could have really positive effects on other diseases and conditions, including type 2 diabetes or fatty liver, NAFLD, also with acid reflux. The first thing they tell you is try to sit up when you go to bed, don't eat a big meal. So that, which often leads to esophageal cancer. So we actually feel it can have a positive impact on many aspects of metabolism, not just cancer. It's just that we're very interested in teasing out its impact on cancer.
That's phenomenal, Ruth, those statistics that you just kind of just threw out there, like 40% reduction in breast cancer recurrence in women that were just simply fasting in the evening for 13 hours.
Right.
I mean, that is...
regardless of what you eat.
Regardless of what you eat.
Controlled for whether you're overweight or not.
Wow.
Right.
Because it's really not that difficult I think it's much easier for people to make a modifiable change of just stopping stop eating after 7 p.m. versus eat all your vegetables, stop eating your cake. I mean, people should do that, but
yes, I still think diet quality matters. But we've done some pilot studies with women adopting a longer nightly fasting interval. And those studies have been amazing in terms of how simple it was for women to do it. We actually had a little app that I used, and they would text us starting my fast, and then we'd text back saying, great, don't forget, don't eat again before 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. And so many participants said, I never understood percent energy from fat. It was always so confusing to me. It made me just feel stupid. I didn't even know how to do it, but I just got this. In 5 minutes, I got this. I could do it. And self-report ways, they reported often sleeping better. And we did it with a group of Latino women, Latinas, in South Bay, and they were particularly positive about it. They said, in my family, if I tried to change up our entire way we eat, sometimes my family members weren't that positive about that. Where's our favorite foods? And she goes, but this, I could do it right away. It was really simple, and it didn't affect the family or our food ways. So it was very easy for me to do within our family without disrupting all of our family behaviors. They were very positive. And often even reported, I felt so proud of myself. Okay, finally I'm doing something. I feel better. Well, I'm going to start walking too. That kind of self-efficacy kind of spread to other health behaviors, which is our hope.
Yeah, great. So these women were being more compliant, which is...
Well, they felt successful instead of feeling like a failure. Right? Writing down everything you eat, running up the calories, you only can do that for a couple of days before you just burn out in the entire exercise. So you feel like, oh, I can't do it. Where they're like, I can do this.
Yeah.
So we think it's incredibly, some of the value is the simple feasibility of it. People can understand it and they can generally implement it. Now, we don't think it necessarily is going to have huge impacts on weight. Like you're probably not going to lose 50 pounds by just making this one change. But we believe it could be an incredible public health intervention where if everybody did it, we could move like the whole disease risk curve down a little bit. And that would have huge impacts on disease risk, which is the alternative is, of course, we spend millions of dollars trying to help a small number of very obese people lose weight, which is very unsuccessful. But if we could move the entire population this way, to this more healthful pattern, we think that could actually affect disease rates in the United States.
That's awesome. You also, just to kind of dive a little bit deeper into some of your more recent research, you mentioned the 13-hour fast overnight and how that was very robustly associated with a 40% reduction in breast cancer recurrence and non-statistically significant reduction in breast cancer mortality. But you also have looked at some of the biomarkers that are known to increase breast cancer risk. And it also, there was an effect on some of those biomarkers like inflammation as well, correct?
Mm-hmm. We've actually seen probably our most consistent effect on something called hemoglobin A1C, which is a marker of your average glucose over about 3 months. So interestingly enough, we saw the association both in a general sample of women from what's called the NHANES survey, so a nationally representative survey of women. We saw that women who fasted longer had lower hemoglobin A1C. And then in our own sample of breast cancer survivors, we found the exact same association, which to us means this is probably strong. So that's one of the reasons we think it might have a huge effect on reducing the risk of diabetes. As far as inflammation, interestingly enough, we only found that it reduced inflammation among women who didn't eat a lot of food late at night. In other words, if your fasting interval was 9 p.m. to 9 a.m., it didn't seem to matter. But if your fasting interval was early in the day, like 6 to 6, then it seemed like the fasting interval reduced CRP. So C-reactive protein, this measure of generalized inflammation. So that's what made us think it's not just the 12 hours, it's the 12 hours only if they start fairly early in the evening. That's when the positive effects happen.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So a couple of points that you mentioned, I just want to circle back to the glycated hemoglobin you mentioned, that basically fasting in the evening had a pretty robust effect in reducing that. And that's a marker, obviously it's a marker of your long-term blood glucose levels.
Absolutely. They use that to approve diabetes drugs. If a diabetes drug reduces hemoglobin A1C, that's how it gets approved. So it's a pretty powerful marker of risk.
So we're talking about, for example, metformin,
yes,
which is a very...
Any diabetes drugs has to move hemoglobin A1C down a certain amount before it can be approved. So if we can do this with a non-pharmacologic approach, with just changing when you stop eating and the fasting interval, I mean, that's pretty exciting. Yeah. And it's really exciting because the truth is all these drugs have side effects. They're not that pleasant to take. A lot of people simply discontinue them on their own. So pills aren't necessarily always the answer, and this offers people a lifestyle choice.
And you mentioned that there were women that were involved that you had basically they made changes. They started fasting in the evening, and they also reduced their H1.
In our pilot studies, we were really focused on the feasibility and acceptability of it. So we didn't have any biomarkers. We were testing, could they do it? And how hard was it for people to do?
Okay.
So that was really a test of, because there's no point in recommending something if people can't do it.
Right.
And that's what we really focused on there in our personal pilot work, is just could they do it? And truthfully, they almost all did it, and they also all said they would recommend it as an eating pattern to their friends, or they would recommend the study, which told us, okay, this is feasible and this is acceptable. And, that's what we're interested in. Is not, if it works, but it's like impossible to do, then it's not a valuable public health intervention.
Yeah. I was wondering, what I was trying to get at is how quick or how soon do you think it could change those
we don't have data
levels? That would be very interesting to see if it's something that can be moved pretty quickly. Or, if it takes longer. I don't know how quick these other, like metformin works.
Oh, yeah. Most of them, the thing about hemoglobin A1C is since it reflects average blood sugar over the past 3 months, it takes about 3 months to move it. Even with a really effective intervention, since it reflects the whole last 3 months, it's like you're cycling through. You have to go a whole 3 months to see it.
Yeah. Right. That makes sense.
Other markers may be faster, but because we already know that if you want to measure these markers, you want people to be fasting. So we know just even one night's fast makes a difference. Right? If you do one night's fast, a lot of these markers will be flatter in the morning than if somebody eats breakfast right before they come in. So what you're doing is you're extending the period of time where you have very low basal levels of a lot of these markers.
Right. I just kind of all of a sudden something came to my mind because, we've been talking a lot about inflammation and these fasting blood glucose levels, fasting insulin. And it just hit, I remember having a conversation with Dr. Panda, and he mentioned something to me that I wasn't aware of about repair mechanisms and fasting. I knew that repair mechanisms were regulated by the circadian rhythm, and I always knew that when you sleep is when you're repairing a lot of damage.
Right.
But it didn't occur to me that also when you sleep is when you're fasting.
Right.
And he had mentioned that there's something inherently important about fasting and repair mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And so, which of course that kind of made me think, wow, that's really interesting. I never thought about it like that. But if you think about, the timing of these repair mechanisms and fasting and how, you're repairing damage, DNA repair mechanisms, and also these autophagy, clearing away damaged cells.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Damaged cells secrete inflammatory mediators. So if you're clearing away the cells that are damaged and secreting more, inflammatory molecules, then possibly that would, lower the inflammation. But it's really interesting how your data suggested that it really had to occur earlier in the evening.
Right.
Do you have any speculation as to why that is?
I suppose we really do think that that your body works best when it's aligned with the circadian rhythm. But I think that is a really good observation. Certainly, the parallel I tend to think of is, we work out, we actually hurt our muscles. And the muscles don't repair and get stronger unless we stop. We have to stop. We have to give them a rest period. And same thing, eating is metabolism. There's a lot of oxidative damage that happens just as we eat. And then the theory is that you need a time off from that damage for the repair mechanisms to come in. So it's an interesting observation in parallel. Personally, that's a little molecular from my research, but yeah, I think it's a good parallel to compare it with, like working out.
Yeah, that is actually, like you mentioned, you need a repair time. Stress can activate stress response pathways that can be beneficial, like in the case of exercise.
Right.
But if you keep on stressing yourself,
you actually get weaker.
Right. There will be no repair. It's
you do need time off. Right. Yeah, exactly.
What about meal frequency? So did that play a role? So if I don't know how long between the fasting and fed state, let's say we're within the 12 hours in the day, we're within that 12-hour, feeding time, allotted time. Does the amount of meals that we eat within that time matter?
I think it's a little bit of a separate question. We tried to control for it in case it did make a difference, because it makes sense if you're eating, let's say 18 hours a day, you're probably going to have more eating episodes per day than if you're only eating for, let's say, 10 hours a day. So just reducing the number of hours that you eat may actually have some impact on how many eating occasions, and which may also relate to disease risk. But we didn't see that to be a really important determinant of disease risk. So we're not really, that's sort of a little bit of a different question. We're not really quite sure. I think that the evidence is really out on meal frequency and disease risk.
Okay.
And if you want, my gut feeling is that if you keep your eating interval fairly short, it may not matter very much. But when your interval is very long, so you're getting, a meal impact, and then a long time with no meal, and then a meal, and then, throughout the day, all those spikes might be more detrimental. But the data on that are really unclear at this time.
Yeah, I think you made some really good points, and that is, if you reduce the amount of time that you're eating, then naturally you would probably then reduce the
you may reduce the frequency
that you're eating. I just remember, I don't know if this is like one of those wives' tales where, the smaller number of meals you eat was supposed to lower your blood. You wouldn't have as big of a blood glucose.
Right.
But then again, you're constantly doing it, so I don't know,
I think, I know of at least one study in the field that's actually testing that, testing 5 meals a day versus 3. So I think they're starting to realize we don't really have a good answer to that, and trials are underway to clarify that.
Okay. One other thing that I was kind of thinking about in the parallels between how this meal timing is having a pretty profound effect on for example, what's considered your long-term blood glucose levels, and also to some degree on inflammation. And these are markers of these markers are known to be associated with increased breast cancer risk. Right. But you said that weight loss may not necessarily occur. But what's interesting, you may not, let's say you don't change the types of foods you eat, but just you're basically only eating, during a 12-hour window during the day, So that in itself may not cause you to lose weight,
or significant amount,
or a significant amount. But what's interesting is that on the flip side, weight loss itself has also been shown to have a positive effect on these same biomarkers.
Yes, right.
And so
we actually think that some of the positive effect might be independent of weight loss. You get the positive effect whether or not you lose weight. In our pilot study, women over a month lost about 1 kilogram, or about a little over 2 pounds. So we did see a modest weight loss. That's very modest. But even the mice studies that Dr. Panda does also tend to suggest that the impacts may be independent. Like, it just helps you regardless of whether you lose weight or not.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. It seems as though it may just really be affecting your metabolism and making sure that you're timing your food intake with when your metabolism's at its best, when you can process these, the sugar and the fats and just everything that you're throwing at it. And that seems to be in and of itself extremely important. Right. So.
And, we have seen in our breast cancer survivor study, we definitely saw an improvement in hours of sleep per night when people had a longer fasting duration. And, bad sleep can also affect biomarkers, and it's its own risk. Right. So that might be partially, it's partially working through direct metabolic effect, but it might be working through other behaviors too. But improving sleep and getting more sleep could also help regulate your metabolism and kind of feed into the positive impacts. Similarly, it's very interesting, but in several mouse studies, they've shown big improvements in spontaneous activity when they're put on when they're not on this fasting regimen. We don't necessarily think that if women or humans adopt a prolonged nightly fast, they're going to start working out at the gym, but there might be some more subtle effects on spontaneous activity, which frankly is the majority of the physical activity most people have, is just spontaneous, everyday, normal activity. So, the animal studies lead us to believe it can have several behavioral impacts in addition to the direct metabolic impacts.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. I wonder if there's just changing the brain, lots of...
It's, the data showing that eating a bunch of food and going to sleep disrupts your sleep has been around a long time. Yeah. It's just, you don't sleep well on a full stomach, just period over out, so it's kind of, that literature has been out there for a while.
I've been practicing this time-restricted feeding now for, once I, Dr. Sachin Panda's work was really eye-opening, and I, thought, well, I'm going to, I usually try to stop eating earlier in the day, and it's a lot easier for me in the fall and winter months when it gets darker earlier and I'm not working so late. The thing for me is when I'm working late. When you start working later, it's light out. I'm like, I got to keep working. Then you start to extend your workday, and that becomes the issue.
Surprise, Western lifestyle is carcinogenic. In case you didn't know that, now you do.
So now we have the bright light exposure in the evening.
Many things about our lifestyle are carcinogenic, right?
It's really not that difficult to do, and I'm just now I start the clock once I have my first cup of coffee, and then it's I got to start cooking dinner, at least 2 hours before that or something. So that way I'm done. And you're not hungry, you're not starving when you go to bed. Some people, I think their fear is, well, you mentioned it's hard to sleep when you're super full, but on the flip side, a lot of people have this mentality that if they're really hungry, you can't sleep.
Right.
But I think there's a nice balance between those two, and that is if you just eat something, in a reasonable time, 7, 8 p.m., stop.
I mean, along with that, I have to say, I probably think it's probably best for you to go to bed at a reasonable hour, not be staying up till 2 a.m. playing video games or whatever, so, it can all be synergistic or in a positive way or in a negative way.
Yeah. I want to kind of shift gears one more time. I think a lot of people have in their minds, at least in the context of breast cancer, many women think about risk factors being genetic. You know, there are certain gene polymorphisms, which are variations in the sequence of DNA that alter the function somewhat, that can put a woman at risk, particularly genes that are involved in repairing DNA damage, specifically in the breast tissue.
Right.
BRCA1, BRCA2, I think many people are familiar with these genes. But really what your research and what a lot of research out there has shown is that there are lifestyle factors that play a, if not equally important role, and certainly in combination with these genetic risk factors would really be very, very important in modifying breast cancer risk. And not only risk, but recurrence. So there are a few types of lifestyle factors that we talked about today that may, dramatically lower a female's breast cancer risk, and also women out there that have had breast cancer. Certain lifestyles they should adopt in order to lower their recurrence. Right. So what do you, if you want to talk about maybe the top ones?
Sure. BRCA1 and 2, if you have that gene, polymorphism, that's a pretty special case. And those women are at very high risk of breast cancer and recurrence. And it's hard to know for that small percentage of women how much lifestyle matters. But again, they're a special case. Majority of cancers are just sporadic. We think that less than 5% overall of breast cancers are the result of genetic factors. And more like 65 to 75% are the result of lifestyle factors, including obesity, diet, physical activity, and smoking. And alcohol, we think maybe, for breast cancer. So those are all things you can modify. So the idea that you're doomed by your genetics couldn't be more wrong. For the vast majority of women, it is your lifestyle choices that will make the biggest difference in your risk, which is not the same thing as saying you're to blame, because a lot of cancers are sporadic, but that there are things you can do to reduce your personal risk a lot.
Well, that's good news.
Yes.
So don't smoke, moderate drink, don't drink a lot. Lose weight.
Lose weight, and even a small amount of weight. Recently, there was a study that seemed to show they saw huge improvements in metabolic health in the first 5% of weight loss. And then they said if you looked at 5 to 10% of weight loss, it's like it flattened out. There wasn't, it isn't like a linear thing. So it looks like even modest weight loss can really improve your metabolic health. So I think there's this perception that, well, if I don't get to model skinny, there's no point in even trying. And I think that's a really wrong way of looking at weight loss. 5% weight loss could really make a difference.
5% of your...
5% and keep it, keep it off. And maybe in a year or two, you might go, well, maybe I'll lose another 5%. But the idea that there's some very linear thing going on, I'm not sure the data really support that. So even modest weight loss, work on the quality of your diet, work on the time of your diet, get some physical activity, please. Avoid long periods of sedentary behavior. All those things combined, good sleep, and good food choices, I think that's the total combination of things is the best thing you can work toward, and just make it a lifestyle to always be working on improving those things your whole life.
I think that's fantastic advice. And I just want to mention that number again, because it really is, the best. Obviously, no one wants cancer. Right. That if you can do whatever you can within your, control to give yourself the best possible chance of not getting cancer, right, then really, 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 you should do it. That's,
And there's a super benefit here is that it likely will reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease, which after all is still the #1 killer of women. So, you're really getting a 360 effect on your risk of all the major killers in America, some unpleasant conditions like diabetes, and also hopefully just feeling better every day.
Absolutely.
Right.
And that's,
quality of life, basic quality of life. Right.
I think there's been studies showing like weight loss improves
Right.
mood,
Yeah.
you know, inflammation's associated with depression,
Yeah.
you know, and inflammation's associated with obesity. So yeah, you're right. All
Right.
these things, your
Physical
quality of life.
activity is associated with reduced risk of depression or ameliorating some of the effects. So there's, you know, it's not like there's a separate list of things you should do for one disease versus another. It's like the total benefit package.
Yeah, they're all overlapping.
Much more overlapping. We used to not think that as much. We used to think they were completely disease. Here's the disease pathway for cardiovascular disease. It's very metabolic. It's blood pressure. It's cholesterol. And here's cancer. And it's a genetic disease. And they're two separate pathways. Now we see that they're actually way more overlapping than we ever knew. And it's really good news because it means you don't have to do separate things for each disease. It means the same suite of healthful behaviors can give you 360 protection.
Well said. And just one last time, that meal timing, women that had breast cancer and had fasted for at least 13 hours overnight had a 40% reduction in breast cancer recurrence.
Right.
I think that's pretty good incentive for women to set that clock when they put the first bite of food in their mouth or the first water beverage, that clock's set, and making sure that you don't eat food, past 7 p.m.
Right, or 8.
7 or 8.
Sachin Panda's work was, he did the most recent article he published, which I thought was very good, looked at mice where he just had them do restricted feeding 5 days a week and then all around the clock, kind of break the fast on the weekend. And he saw much of the same effects, which means, you don't also have to be perfect. As long as most of the time you do it, you don't need to feel like a failure, like, oh, I went out, I ate so late, it's fine. Just pick up the next day and get started again.
Thank you for bringing that up because, weekends are when we have that social pressure.
Right.
We're having later dinners, we're having drinks, so it's nice to know that at least if the animal studies do translate to the human studies, that we can at least break the rules or cheat a little bit on weekends.
I think that's a plus side, is that it's not about being perfect. It's about mostly doing it, and you'll get most of the benefit, right?
Agreed. Well, Dr. Ruth, thank you so much for your time and for the phenomenal research that you're doing. And
thank you.
I really look forward to reading more and keeping an open line of discussion with you to learn more about some of what your research is showing in terms of the meal timing and breast cancer incidence. So.
Great. Thank you, Rhonda.